Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Difficult Employees, Tough Conversations and Fair Work Risks. My name's Alistair and I'll be your host for this morning. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes, but we do have a number of people still signing on, so please sit tight with us for a couple of minutes and we'll just wait for the rest of the audience to join. We'll be getting started soon. Okay, it looks like we have the majority of people who have joined, so we'll get underway. Um, Now, before we get started, we should see a poll that should be creeping up onto your screen now. And we've put together a few quick questions to give us some insights into where your business sits and what you're currently managing by way of performance and conduct issues. There's no right or wrong to these answers, but it just helps us tailor this session a little bit more and make sure that we're covering what matters most to you. So I will ask that everyone takes a minute just to fill that in, and we'll share the results a little bit more towards the end of the session. All right, we'll just give 30 more seconds. If everyone could please ensure we've done that, that'd be wonderful. And we'll circle back and share some of those findings towards the end of today's session. So let's get started. Thank you firstly for everyone joining us today. My name's Alistair McDonald and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Citation Group. Today's webinar is going to cover difficult employees, tough conversations, and fair work risks. Now, historically, this has been one of our most sought after webinars and always draws a lot of attention, mainly because this is a universal issue. It doesn't matter what industry you're in or what size of business you are or how good your culture is. At some point, you can guarantee that if you're managing people, you will get a difficult employee, a tough conversation, or a fair work claim that you didn't see coming. Now, I think many of us would agree that this has been quite front and center lately. You can't turn on the news without seeing another workplace story making headlines. I'm sure many of us would be familiar with the recent Carl Stekanovic case, which was full of crisis talks, a breach of contract notice, and an immediate exit. And I think it would also be fair to say that not many people in Australia would have missed the recent debacles with Kyle Sandilands and the blowback on that to the organisation. I guess the takeout is that this stuff doesn't stay in the boardroom anymore. It can end up on breakfast TV. So if you've ever watched one of those stories and thought that could be us, you're probably in the exact right position today. But if you're a smaller business and you're not too worried about the blowback on your brand, just remember that workforce management is far more impactful than mass media coverage and sites like Glassdoor, particularly with the word of mouth that is spreading today, where it can blow back on the organisation. The downstream impacts are, of course, it's difficult to hang on to staff or attract talent if you do have a negative perception out in the market. And it's also difficult to attract new customers alike. So before we start, we'll just dive into a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, if you've got a question throughout the session, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. We will be trying to address as many of those at the end as possible. Don't wait till the end to submit them though. As they come up, if there's something you're not sure about, please drop it in so that we can make sure we're capturing it. The session is being recorded and we'll send the recording link out to everyone after the webinar today. So you can revisit this if you like or share it with your colleagues. Now, we do have a couple of hundred people joining us today, which is great to see. And given the strong attendance, I'm guessing that many of you are here because you do want to get ahead of things like an unfair dismissal, potential bullying complaints, or formal disputes as they arise in Fair Work claims. Now, most of those, the risk really originates with poorly handled conversations with difficult employees. So I'm really happy to see so many of you joined us today. And by the time we finish, we'll have a clearer picture of the practical tools that you can take away and hopefully stay ahead of these issues. Now, I'd like to start by introducing today's guest speaker, Annabelle Basil, who's a workplace relations advisor at Citation HR. Annabelle's a workplace relations consultant with a strong background in providing employment relations advice across a diverse range of industries. She specializes in delivering practical, commercially focused guidance to help businesses navigate complex workplace issues with a high degree of confidence. Combined with her previous experience as an internal HR professional, Annabelle brings a balanced perspective across both HR and ER. Now, this enables her to provide clear, practical advice on employee management, workplace issues, and award interpretation by supporting businesses to manage risk while achieving their people objectives. I think this is particularly relevant given the issues that we're going to dive into this morning. Now, before I hand over to her, just a little update and overview of who we are. Citation Group's been supporting Australian businesses for well over 30 years. We started our journey back in 1992 as a specialised employment relations law firm and have grown out of that model to become a comprehensive and holistic compliance solution business. So we provide expertise in both HR, workplace health and safety, quality assurance, and legal compliance. We work with tens of thousands of businesses across the country, from very small teams right through to supporting ASX 200 companies. We want to help them stay compliant, manage risk, and essentially build better workplaces. So if you'd like to learn more about what we do, please feel free to reach out after today's session. Now, as far as what we're going to be covering today, I'd just like to flash up our agenda. We'll be taking you through the facts on where things stand for Australian businesses currently. We'll then be passing to Annabelle to reframe how we think about the so-called difficult employees, whilst navigating tough conversations and hopefully mitigating fair work risks. We'll provide takeaways, and plus there'll be some time at the end for some questions. And we'll look to circle back to the live poll results from the beginning of the session today. But let's get started. Before we begin, I'd like to share with you some results that we recently found after we commissioned a study into 510 Australian businesses, which has culminated in our inaugural Workforce Pulse report. Now, we will be giving the QR code to download this report, but just before we get to that, what I want to do is call out some key statistics that really floated up to the top and called out some particular risks when it comes to dealing with the topic we want to discuss today. Firstly, nearly 3/4 of the businesses we spoke to have told us that managing HR, payroll, and safety compliance feels more complex than ever before. And when it comes to the human side of doing the job, whilst also navigating those compliance challenges, nearly half say that performance issues worry them the most. And that's probably because that's where the tough conversations start. Nearly 37% name difficult conversations as the single biggest people management issue that keeps them awake at night. And the stakes are real in the sense that 1 in 4 leaders say that people issues escalate further than expected. So the bottom line is that managing people's harder than ever. The human conversations, though, are really what is the hardest part that are keeping businesses on their toes. Which brings us to the next interesting group of findings, which we've deemed to call the readiness gap. When we've really interrogated the data and gotten under the hood, there appears to be a gap between how ready employers feel and how ready they actually are. And some of the stats we're going to go through now really bring that to light. 25% of businesses manage HR with no clear process. It's just the owner or manager handling things as and when they arise. Now, this is understandable for sort of smaller businesses who might think HR is something in the realm of 50 plus employee organizations. However, this reactive seat of the pants approach to managing people is a really worrying stat where issues quickly blow up with little warning and quite often unforeseen circumstances. 61% of businesses surveyed say that safety and well-being responsibilities are adding to their stress when they're trying to run their organization. And 23%, so nearly 1 in 4, aren't confident in identifying or managing the most emerging area of work health and safety issues, which is the psychosocial risks, particularly as how that impacts mental health in the workplace. It is a growing area of legal obligation and not just a nice to have. But it really seems that this is where businesses really come unstuck in understanding what are their responsibilities in ensuring employees don't just get home physically safe at the end of the day, but mentally safe as well. Now, in regards to what does the gap cost businesses, the median mental health claim is now sitting at $67,400. Now, that is 4 times higher than the costs of a typical physical injury that's experienced in the workplace. So, confidence is high, but it appears to us that readiness isn't keeping pace with that level of confidence. And that gap is really where the risk lies and something that we want to unpack in a little bit more detail today. So if we want to talk about some stats that we're seeing in the broader environment, those conversations are happening. In 2024 and 2025, the Fair Work Commission received 44,000 applications. Now, that's nearly 24% above the previous 5-year average. Now, of those, over 16,500 related to unfair dismissal claims and general protections dismissal claims. The ones tied to discrimination, adverse action, and those kind of things are up 45% since 2024. It's gotten so bad that the Fair Work Commission President, Justice Hatcher, himself described the current caseload as being unsustainable. But the takeaway is simple. The cost of getting it wrong has never, ever been higher. Now, we mentioned before that we were going to give you the opportunity to download the Workforce Pulse. We're about to pull up a QR code on the next slide, and I'll just pause for a minute to let everyone take out their phones and download that. Now, just while we're doing so, we should point out that this Workforce Pulse, the Confidence Trap, as it's now known, has only gone live in the last month. So it is hot off the press. There's a lot of great findings within it, and we will shortly be launching a diagnostic tool for businesses to benchmark themselves against the findings that we've found here. Okay, we'll pull this slide up back at the end, but without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Annabelle, who will take us through some more of the meaty parts of the conversation today.
Amazing. Thanks, Ali. Hi, everyone. As Ali said, I'm a workplace relations consultant at Citation HR. Now, I want to start today's session by reframing something that we hear all the time, the idea of the difficult employee. It's a label that gets used very quickly in organizations. Now, this session, it's not about problem people. It's about navigating performance issues, behavioral challenges, and increasing workplace risk in what is now a much more complex environment. The challenge with the label difficult employees is that it doesn't actually tell us what the problem is. And more importantly, it doesn't tell us how to fix it. When we describe someone as difficult, we tend to bundle together very different issues, and that's where the mistakes happen. Because how we respond depends entirely on what's actually driving the behavior. So instead of asking, why is this person being difficult? We need to be asking, what is actually happening here? So, the shift in the landscape. What we're seeing across almost every industry is a consistent pattern. Managers are hesitating to address issues early. HR teams are becoming involved in matters that would previously have been handled at a line manager level, and performance conversations that used to be relatively straightforward are escalating, sometimes quite quickly, into complaints, disputes, or formal processes. A simple piece of feedback can now be interpreted as unfair treatment or even bullying. And because of that, people delay action. But that delay is where risk builds. So the key message I want to set early is that we don't need to be more cautious. We need to act earlier and be clearer, and we need to be more structured. The reason that this matters more now is because the risk environment has evolved significantly. Firstly, we have unfair dismissal risk, which says it's no longer enough to show that there was a valid reason. The focus is equally on whether the process was fair, reasonable, and properly followed. Secondly, we have adverse action. This is where an employee may claim that action was taken against them because they exercised a workplace right. for example, raising a complaint or taking leave. Now, even if that's not your intention, you need to be able to demonstrate that your decisions were based on legitimate and documented reasons. And thirdly, we have psychosocial hazards. As Ali mentioned, this is a really important development. Workplace risk now include things like poorly handled performance management, unmanaged conflict, or lack of support. So performance management is no longer just operational. It intersects with compliance, safety, and culture. And that's why structured documentation is really important. So moving on to reframing difficult. In most situations, what's being labeled as difficult can be broken down into one of three categories. The first is the capability gap, where the person doesn't currently have the skills, knowledge, or clarity to perform the role as expected. The second is a conduct issue, where expectations are understood, but behavior is not meeting the required standard. And third is often overlooked, which is a leadership gap, where expectations haven't been set clearly, reinforced, or managed consistently. The distinction really matters because if we treat a capability issue like misconduct, we risk being unfair. And if we treat a conduct issue like a training issue, we risk enabling poor behavior. If the issue is actually leadership related, then no amount of performance management directed at the employee will resolve it. So what we're aiming for is an accurate diagnosis because that's what leads to effective and defensible action. I also wanted to briefly touch on AI. Just wait for the slide. As I think we can all agree, AI is a really useful tool when used correctly. It can help managers structure conversations, put project plans together, and draft documentation. When used carefully, it can absolutely support consistency and save time. However, it's important to approach it with a level of caution. AI is only as good as the input it receives, and there is always a risk that the information it produces is incomplete, outdated, or simply not right for your specific context, which can lead to the spread of misinformation or incorrect processes being followed. From a risk perspective, AI generated content on its own is not defensible. If a matter escalates, whether it's a complaint, a claim, a formal dispute, the organization is who is responsible for the decision that was made, not the tool that was used. So, while AI can be helpful in shaping thinking or providing a starting point, it shouldn't replace sound judgment, proper process, or tailored decision making. Now, we'll deep dive a little bit into conduct issues. This is where the employee is capable of performing the role, but their behavior is not meeting expectations. Now, this can look like breaching policies and procedures, inappropriate communication or tone, refusal to follow direction, or negative impact on team dynamics. A key indicator here is that expectations are known, but they are not being followed. This is a deliberate choice. The risk in these situations is under addressing the behavior. Organizations sometimes default to giving more support or more chances when what's actually needed is clearer accountability. If conduct issues aren't addressed properly, the risks include erosion of team standards, disengagement from high performers, inconsistency in how rules are applied, and potential escalation into grievances or formal complaints. So the approach needs to be shifted slightly. In terms of practical tools, we can make sure that we're being very clear and direct about the behavior. We link behavior back to the impact that it has on the team or the business. We set clear boundaries and consequences and document conversations objectively and accurately. This is also where consistency matters most, because once one person's behavior is seen to be tolerated, it becomes much harder to manage across the rest of the team. So the focus here is accountability, clarity, and follow through. Then you have the capability gap. This is where employees are struggling to meet expectations, not because they're unwilling, but because they are unable. They genuinely can't. They don't know what they're doing, at least right now. This can look like missed deadlines, inconsistencies in work quality, reliance on others for basic tasks, or confusion around priorities. You'll also hear things like, I didn't realize that was the expectation, or I'm not sure how to approach that. Now, the risk in these situations is misclassifying this as a conduct issue. If we move too quickly to warnings or formal action without addressing capability, we expose the organization to unfair dismissal risk, challenges around lack of support or training, and increasingly psychosocial risk related to perceived pressure or lack of clarity. So, what do we do instead? We make sure that we are clearly defining expectations, not just the outcomes, but what good actually looks like. We need to break work into measurable checkpoints rather than broad responsibilities. We need to provide targeted training and coaching, and importantly, set regular check ins to track progress. Because capability issue, when managed early and clearly, is often actually the easiest to resolve. But when it's ignored, this can turn into performance management processes that feel both unfair and avoidable. The third category, and one that is often overlooked, is the leadership gap. This is where the issue isn't solely the employee's behavior or capability, but the environment or management approach around them. This can look like unclear or changing expectations, inconsistent management across team members, delayed feedback, or situations where issues are only addressed once they've escalated. You may also see different standards being applied to different people or confusion within the team around what good performance looks like. The risk here is significant because when the leadership gap exists, performance issues become harder to address, employees may raise claims of unfair treatments or inconsistency, and processes can break down under scrutiny, particularly informal disputes. There's also a cultural impact. Teams lose trust when expectations aren't clear or consistently applied. Some practical fixes here include setting clear, consistent expectations from the outset, having regular structured check ins rather than ad hoc conversations, addressing issues early and not waiting them to escalate, and ensuring managers are aligned in how they apply their standards. This is also where supporting managers is essential because, in many cases, what appears to be employee issues is actually a lack of structure, confidence, or consistency at the leadership level. And once it's addressed, many difficult situations tend to resolve themselves. I once worked with a business where a manager described an employee as difficult because they were missing deadlines and seemed disengaged. The assumption was that it was a performance or attitude issue. But when we unpacked it, what came out of it was that the employee had recently taken on additional responsibilities, hadn't been trained, and wasn't clear on priorities. So what looked like a conduct issue was actually a capability and clarity issue. Once expectations were reset and support was provided, performance improved quite quickly. Now, moving on to tough conversations, everyone's favorite. Managers don't avoid these conversations because they don't care. They avoid them because they are unsure. They're concerned about saying the wrong thing. They may have had a prior situation escalate, or they simply don't have a clear process to follow. So instead, they soften their language, they delay the conversation, or they avoid it altogether. And unfortunately, what that does is allow small issues to grow into much more complex and high risk situations. So, how do we have a performance conversation that works? The goal is to not make managers experts in employment law. The goal is to give them enough structure that they feel confident to act early and appropriately. When it comes to delivering feedback, structure is one of your best tools. A simple and effective approach is starting with an objective observation. For example, over the past 3 weeks, I've noticed that the deadlines for X and Y haven't been met. Then move on and explain the impact. This is affecting the team's ability to meet client deadlines. And then clearly state the expectation. Moving forward, deadlines need to be met or any delays need to be communicated in advance. What this does is keep the conversation grounded in facts and outcome. It avoids personal language, reduces defensiveness. And importantly, it creates clarity because unclear feedback is one of the biggest drivers of repeat issues. To compare that in practice, I often see managers saying things like, "You've been a bit off lately," or "Your attitude hasn't been great." And what tends to happen is the employee becomes defensive or confused because they don't actually know what needs to be changed. Whereas if you say the last 3 reports were submitted late and that impacts our ability to meet client deadlines, it becomes much harder to dispute and much easier to act on. Okay, so moving on to feedback. When feedback is rejected, and sometimes you get an emotional response, I think we've all been there. There will be times where employees disagree with feedback. They may say it's unfair, or others have behaved the same way, or it's just your opinion. The key in those moments is not to get drawn into a debate. Instead, acknowledge their perspective respectfully and come back to expectations. For example, I understand that you see it differently. The expectation still stands, and we'll review your progress over the next few weeks. Agreement is not the goal, clarity is the goal. And maintaining that clarity protects both working relationship and the process. These conversations can involve emotions. You might experience defensiveness, frustration, or even distress from the employees. Your role is not to absorb or match that emotion. Your role is to keep the conversation steady and focused. Some techniques that help include slowing down the pace, maintaining a calm tone, and acknowledging the emotion without shifting away from the purpose of the discussion. For example, I can see that this is frustrating. Let's focus on what we need to do together moving forward. That approach maintains both respect and direction. Sometimes employers find themselves in situations where an employee has been given feedback and they have had an extreme emotional reaction, such as not being able to attend work or refusing to work with different people. We often get asked what the next steps are. Can we continue with performance management? Can we still issue warnings? Or can we even still terminate if they're not at work? The answer is call us. It is such a complex situation that needs to be managed very carefully. It's not impossible to deal with, but there's a number of variables that need to be considered, and our team are happy to guide you. In many organizations, everything ends up being escalated to HR. And while HR does play a critical role, that model is not sustainable. It creates delays and can reduce manager accountability. Instead, we want managers to feel equipped to handle early stage issues themselves. That might include providing conversation frameworks, simple escalation guides, or decision making prompts. HR should be there to support and guide, not to be the only point of action, because the longer we delay, the greater the risk becomes. Hopefully, after today, managers will feel confident having these conversations with their team. Of course, if there are escalations, we absolutely recommend reaching out to HR professionals for further support. Now, I mentioned procedural fairness earlier on, especially around the topic of unfair dismissal. And procedural fairness, it can sound complex, but at its core, it's actually quite straightforward. It's about ensuring that your process is fair, reasonable, and transparent. A simple way to approach it is in 5 steps. Step 1, clearly identify and communicate the issue. An employee needs to have, or it needs to be reasonable to assume that the employee is aware of the issue. Second, provide any relevant information or examples. They need to know where they're going wrong so that they can know what to fix. Third, give the employee a genuine opportunity to respond. I cannot highlight how important that genuine opportunity to respond is. Also, from an employer perspective, that's where things come out of the woodworks that then might raise red flags in terms of other risks that we need to consider. So actually, that stage is also really beneficial for you guys. Fourth, consider the response objectively. And fifth, make a decision and document it clearly and objectively. Where organizations run into difficulty is where the steps are rushed, skipped, or where the outcome appears predetermined. Fairness doesn't mean avoiding difficult decisions. It means making those decisions in a structured and defensible way. Now, one of the most effective ways to reduce risk is to act early. Addressing behavior when it first appears is significantly easier than addressing it once it becomes a pattern. A short, well-structured conversation early on can prevent a formal process later. Waiting for things to become more serious rarely leads to a better outcome. So, if something feels slightly off, it's usually worth addressing. It doesn't need to be formal, but it does need to be clear. An example here is that we've worked with a client where a team member had started making dismissive comments in meetings. Nothing overly serious at first, but enough to create some tension. The manager chose not to address it early, thinking it might just pass. Now, over time, that behavior escalated. other team members become frustrated, and eventually a formal complaint was raised. What could have been addressed with a simple 10-minute early conversation turned into a formal investigation process. That's the cost of waiting. Now, when do you escalate? There are situations where informal conversations are not enough. In those cases, escalations may be appropriate. This could include formal warnings, performance improvement plan, or investigations. The key is that escalations should not come as a surprise. Employees should never feel that this has come out of absolutely nowhere. There should be a clear pathway with expectations communicated along the way. And importantly, your documentation should reflect that journey. At any point, you should be able to show what was discussed, what support was provided, and why the next step was reasonable. An organization had an employee who consistently underperformed over several months. The manager had documented informal conversations, clearly outlined expectations, provided opportunity to improve, and implemented a performance improvement plan. When the employment was eventually terminated, the employee challenged the decision. However, because the organization could demonstrate a clear, fair, and consistent process, the decision was upheld. What protected them wasn't just the outcome, it was the process. And that's the key takeaway when it comes to escalation. So you obviously want to protect your culture when having these conversations. And managing performance is not just about managing risk, it's about protecting the team culture. When poor performance or behavior is not addressed, it impacts others. High performers may disengage, standards can drop, and trust in leadership can decrease. Addressing issues consistently and fairly reinforces expectations and strengthens culture. Avoiding action often causes more harm than taking action. To make this sustainable, simplicity is key. So, some practical tools. We want to make sure we're using structured conversation frameworks to guide discussions. We want to develop consistent documentation habits. Even brief notes can make a significant difference. And we want to introduce decision checkpoints. Before taking action, ask yourself, is this fair? Is this consistent? And could I clearly explain this decision if I needed to? If the answer is yes, you're generally in a strong position. So, to summarize, I appreciate that was a lot, but to summarize, we want to avoid labeling and focus on diagnosing the issue correctly. We then want to act early rather than waiting for issues to escalate. And thirdly, we want to follow a structured and fair process. If you consistently apply those principles, you will reduce risk, you will improve outcomes, and you will increase manager confidence. Thank you.
Annabelle, thank you. That was amazing. There was a tremendous amount to digest there, but a lot of really practical insights as well. So look, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't been taking notes so far, I would implore you to get your pens out. And we want to dive a little bit into what are some of the recommended steps you can take to safeguard against the risks that we've identified today, and what are some of the tools that you might need to arm yourself to be in the best position to defend against them. So firstly, I think we heard time and again the importance of evidence and record keeping. So firstly, ensure that you centralize your employee records and processes as much as possible. Log every conversation, every warning that you have against the employee file so you can refer back to it. And because a documented process, as we've heard, is your best defense. Now, nearly every HR software, regardless of what it is, will have this basic functionality as far as centralized record keeping and note taking. And we'd implore you to absolutely ensure you are using this at the bare minimum. If you don't have a HRIS, I would absolutely encourage you to explore the merits of obtaining one. It does provide you that one central place of truth and allow you to be capturing all that information that you can then refer back to. And quite often as well, moving to the second point, the place where you can actually keep your policies and ensure that they have been acknowledged by the employee. So a solid policy suite anchors every difficult conversation and sets clear and unequivocal standards for right and wrong in the business. We constantly hear time and time again, I didn't know it was wrong, as an all too common response from difficult employees to either justify or excuse actions that most of us would understand, even from a common sense viewpoint, were the wrong ones to take. However, without a signed policy to point to, it can be much, much harder to refute this claim of ignorance. Thirdly, Make sure you audit your HR architecture and framework regularly. Policies can quickly become outdated due to the dynamic and rapidly changing legal landscape, and a regular audit is important to find gaps before they become issues and, of course, before they then become claims. So we support businesses with each element of this, but regardless of where you are or who you turn to for support, make sure that you've got the centralized record keeping, current policies, and that you are constantly auditing them to make sure you're staying abreast of legislative change. In the next slide, we want to make sure that before you act, make sure you speak to someone who knows what they are doing. So call your advisor. That could be an internal HR professional, general counsel, or an external professional that you turn to. But before you act with a warning, termination, performance improvement plan, whatever it might be, ensure that you've stress tested this and get an expert eyes on the procedural fairness. A short call, as Annabelle pointed out to, absolutely beats a Fair Work claim down the road. Fifth, and this is an absolutely emerging area that we are seeing time and time again, people telling us that they've turned to ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini to actually test what their rights are as an employer. Please, please, please don't let AI make the call for you. It can inform your thinking, and it can be there as a source to turn to maybe validate some of the facts, but it will not know the full history, and it most certainly will not be standing up to defend you in the Fair Work Commission. So decide with the experts and definitely not with the algorithms. Okay, just getting into some of what you actually told us, we've got the results from the poll, which we'd like to just share with you. And I'm going to read some of these key stats out, which is quite interesting. Some of them are a little concerning, but I think hopefully some of the issues that you've highlighted here can be addressed and take away some of the practical tips you've heard about today. So interestingly, 90% of respondents have said that managers aren't fully confident in handling a difficult conversation and without some level of discomfort or escalating risk. 90%. That is a big, big number. But in fairness as well, I think that's not to be unexpected. No one likes having difficult conversations. They have the tendency to get emotional. And as we pointed out time and again, you need to ensure you have the right processes behind you to support those conversations. Okay? Only 21% have rated their Fair Work documentation as strong, with clear records of every conversation and decision being captured. Now, that does provide a big record gap there if 4/5 of us aren't confident in your policies and frameworks, employee handbooks, or the fact that you're actually capturing these records of conversations that you may well need to refer back to. So we'd implore you, refer back to the number one takeaway, find a place to store your documents, find a place to ensure you're capturing the conversations, build that body of evidence just to safeguard against it. And it also, of course, helps you have more informed conversations with the employee when we want to highlight areas of underperformance or areas where they need to improve. 62% said managers are only somewhat equipped. They're uncomfortable but functioning in having these. Look, there's always the opportunity for additional training, but as we said before, pick up the phone, speak to an advisor, get some coaching or sense check what it is you want to do before taking the conversation to the employee or deciding what action to take after it. 36% said that they would often wait a week or two to see if a performance issue resolves itself. I think that probably, as we've heard today, is exposing the organization to some risk. So look, we'll leave it there as far as the polls are concerned. I would encourage you to absolutely download our Workforce Pulse report, see how your responses have stacked up to what we're seeing as the averages or responses within the Australian businesses that we've surveyed. But also, we will be shortly launching the diagnostic tool for you to take yourself and benchmark yourself against those responses. So do look out for that. It will be coming off the back of this webinar and should hopefully provide you with a really practical tool to see where some of those risks might be arising. Okay, now I will point out that we've had a great number of questions. Some of them are probably questions that would require an individual conversation with one of our advisors, given the nature of it. Nothing we're going to answer today can be misconstrued as advice, if I can put it that way. It would be far more general and unpacking some of these. But there's a couple here, particularly a trend about 4 that's relating to neurodiversity. So a couple of these have said if a staff member doesn't reveal their diagnosis of ADHD or autism, but use this as a reason for non-performance, how would this work? Secondly, I think there's a lot of concern regarding conduct issues been explained by employees as being related to neurodiversity. Do you have suggestions for managing such situations? And some 23% also saying here difficult employees are defined by Bill Eddy of the High Conflict Institute of those who do not respond to usual performance management processes. There's no point in continuing the standard processes if you're dealing with a person who may or may not have a personality disorder and hijacks the conversations. So, look, all very interesting questions, quite in depth. I would point out that I don't think we want to conflate the two issues or in any way think that we would be labeling people with a specific medical diagnosis as being difficult. I think we would be tiptoeing far too close into the realm of discrimination. What I would say is if you do have an employee who you feel falls into one of these camps, speaking to a qualified professional to work out the best approach to this is absolutely, absolutely critical. So I will suggest, please phone our advice team. We'd be more than happy to provide some complimentary, obligation-free advice to help deal with these specific questions. The telephone number is 02 9083 0033. Give us a call. We might unpack those in a little bit more detail once we understand the specific situations that we're talking about there. But there are a few more questions that I think might be easier for us to delve into. One, does the process of having a conversation with a difficult employee matter as much if an employee is in probation? Annabelle, any thoughts on how probation impacts conversations?
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that we see very often. So, just to kind of provide some context, typically a probation period, it's a period of time for you and the employee to learn about each other. Is this a good fit? Highs, lows, kind of experience all of those things. It kind of loosely ties into the minimum employment period that an employee has to work to be able to claim unfair dismissal. So in large businesses, this is of 15 or more employees. Someone has to have worked with you for 6 months to claim unfair dismissal. For a small business of 14 or less employees, they have to have worked with you for 12 months to claim unfair dismissal. The reason that that's relevant here is because when someone can't claim unfair dismissal, the procedure can be a little bit more lenient, essentially. You do have a bit more flexibility to kind of manage it a bit more in like a kind of one-stop process than the sort of elongated process, when it's performance management, things like that. What I would still take away from this is even though they can't claim unfair dismissal, I would recommend still remembering that this is a person finding out about their employment and still to treat people as people. So they do have it does also have a knock-on effect from like a culture standpoint of how you do this as well. So yes, it doesn't matter as much if they are within their probation, but it's not technically probation. It's within the minimum employment period. So that's 6 or 12 months, depending on business size. The process can be a bit more like bring you into a meeting. Here's what the issue is. Do you have anything to say? Okay, that's, we've made the decision anyway. But as Ali said, this is not advice. Please do not just take what I've said and run with it. Please call us because we will absolutely advise through those processes.
Thanks, Annabelle. We've got another one here that begins with hypothetically speaking. So I think that's good in regards to no one's going to assume this is specific advice. But hypothetically speaking, is there a way that a role can be made redundant instead of managing an employee's performance?
Again, another question that we see very, very often. What I typically say to my clients when they call through is sometimes you need to pick a lane. And what that means is that by deciding what route you're going to go down, whether it's performance or whether it's redundancy, that's going to avoid muddying the water and risking something coming from it. If you've had all of these performance performance concerns about someone and you've already started a performance process, you're going to have a really, really strong business case to justify why this role from an operational standpoint is able to be made redundant. Because if you don't have that and you've already started the performance conversations, That's where then the unfair dismissal risk comes in, because it can be claimed that it was not a genuine redundancy, it was that you just didn't like that person. So there are ways of doing it, but again, things like documentation is really important, and the business context is really important, and making sure that you can link back the role to the operational function and have it separate from the employee that performs the role.
Thanks, mate. One or two more if we've got time. This is a good question. I think when documenting informal conversations, does a copy of the record need to be sent to the employee or can it just be retained internally?
Yeah, good question. So I would say that it doesn't need to be again formally like confirmed with the employee. If you wanted to have a conversation and then just follow up with an email and just say, hey, so and so, just to recap the conversation, these are the things we discussed, let's chat about it in our next one-on-one next week. That type of stuff absolutely is so fine. You don't need to kind of send meeting minutes or anything like that to for informal conversations. Again, it kind of loops back to, does the employee, or is it reasonable to assume that the employee has an understanding of their expectations? So sending kind of informal comms is going to support the fact that the employee does have reasonable understanding of what the expectations are. But no, I would say at the bare minimum, informal stuff, just document that internally, save it to their file. It doesn't need to be sent to them.
Amazing. One last question, and I'm so sorry. There is a list of these. We won't have time to get through them all, but again, encourage you to pick up the phone and give us a call if you want to have a chat through some of these more specific ones. One here that I think probably lends itself a little bit more to training requirements for managers. I've developed a discussion framework and it never gets used. So just some tips or advice on usage uptake in regards to how you can get managers to actually ensure, I guess, they're adhering to the processes or the framework that the organization
Mm.
has set up. Any tips on
Yeah.
that, Annabelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really important to share with the managers that they are also accountable for their direct reports, and anything that their people that they look after, anything that they do well or do badly is a reflection of them as a manager. So I think it's important to highlight that. I also think it's important to remember that they are employees too. And actually, if you are giving reasonable direction, that they are to be following these frameworks, that is also then a case of them performing their role as well. And so we obviously want to avoid it, but if it gets to a point where then consistently managers are not using or following reasonable business directions, well, then sometimes the manager then has to have those performance conversations as well.
Amazing. Annabelle, thanks so much. That's been really, really informative. We will just jump to the next screen to give everyone a chance, if they missed it earlier on, to download the Workforce Pulse report. As I said, we delve into some more issues and some of the stats and real world feedback from businesses who are dealing with a range of workplace issues or concerns, and I guess overlay some empirical evidence or some statistical data that actually helps bring this to life and helps, I guess, size the prize a little bit in regards to the severity of some of these issues as they're impacting Australian businesses. So if you haven't already, please get out your phone, download the QR code. And as I said before, there will be a follow-up diagnostic tool that we're releasing in the coming week that will help you sort of benchmark your own organization or perhaps unpack, where you're running into some issues or concerns. That's all the time we have today. So thank you so much for joining us. A huge thank you to Annabelle for such a valuable session. As I mentioned, we will be sending out a recording link out to everyone. So keep an eye on your inbox. If you do have further questions or you'd like to chat, as I mentioned, give us a call. Don't hesitate to get in touch with us, particularly in regards to some short, as I said, obligation-free advice if there's something you're dealing with now. Other than that, have a wonderful day and we will look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks so much.